First of all, we started. I would like to think about the methodologies. I'm a professor, and we noticed that the biography of Rob Morris was very important, and in the work of Nancy Thies, that is the world expert. And I was thinking, why we don't have more world experts on Rob Morris? But we have it on other founders of other organizations, and particularly the male side of Freemasonry, the Comasonic. So I think we need to think about that. And the work of Nancy, forgive me if I use your first name, so that's easier for me. And I will do that so we can be more like a family. And we learned that, we saw all the archival work that Nancy did and how it is connected and relevant with the foundation of the Order of the Eastern Star. And also, Rob Morris didn't care about ridicule, didn't care about the strong tradition, and he founded this organization that still very much alive and kicking and all around the world, and we see that is very successful. Then also using, and I really love the little lodge on the prairie and the idea of the lodge, how some of these narratives of women, which sometimes we also just don't take them seriously. We think that they're like pink novels or they belong to a special section in the newspapers, particularly in the 19th century. How these narratives help us understand through the lens of Laura Ingalls that I learned when I was young in Mexico, because I saw we used to call it Los Pioneros. And in Spain was translated literally, translation in Mexico, we call them the pioneers. But I was familiar with Laura Ingalls, and I know that Melissa Gilbert played her role. And how these practices and how you can learn with your very extensive archival work. We learn about the use of narratives and the use of, writings that usually we always give we not just said the writings or the books, we said women's writing, women's book, women's Freemasonry. In neutral words that we should not do that. We should actually, because everything should become mainstream. And thank you, Teresa. Then Amanda Brozana, who had to leave, really taught me, and at least particularly myself, who I did not much about the Grange, that Paul has been telling, Guillermo, you should also know about the Grange. But I cannot study all, Paul. The professor always telling the student. But we learned a lot about this fraternal organization, that also within the fraternal organizations, Paul has an article that was published back in the late 90s about grandfather secrets. And his argument was that Freemasonry are the grandparents, let's use the grandparents, of many other fraternal orders. And we learned about, Phi Beta Kappa and the College of William and Mary 1776, or many other fraternal organizations. And the Grange is not the exception. And we learned also that there were some equity practices within the Grange, particularly in the youth. And I think that also there are some sociological aspects there. And I was thinking also about the sociological term intersectionalities, in which we think about ethnicity, class, race, gender, sexuality, social status, and ability as well. Disability studies is something that is also very interesting that we need to think about it. Then Cecile really gave us this ample perspective on 3 countries. And from the historical perspective, that we know that she's a remarkable historian and has written pivotal pieces on Prince Hall Freemasonry and also on French women Freemasonry, but also the linguistic aspect that has been, I've thought about it, and many people, particularly debates with feminists in Spanish and French about the general terms, the general debates about the neutral terms or the not so neutral terms, but also within Freemasonry. To my knowledge, nobody has done it, and I think that's something that we need to explore in Italian as well, and something important that we need to consider and see what is the impact on Freemasonry. Because we, as we know, in countries like such as Spain, that under the supervision of Jose Antonio Ferrer Benimeli, there are so many dissertations on Freemasonry, and also in France, that I wish other countries would follow the lead, at least in academia. In the United States, in Latin America, we don't have so many. I think Spain and France, in that regard, um, I'm sorry for the Brits and for the Americans, but they are the leaders, and it's so much to learn about it. Sometimes we have the limitations of the language, but today we notice that we can do it. Thank you, Cecile, for being the interpreter of Olivia's work, and also Demetrio for Emanuela. And Emanuela actually, she says that she didn't speak English, but I was able to follow the whole time in her paper. So I think that's something important, that we need to try to also break the barrier of the language. And that is why we have the Journal of Ritual, Secrecy, and Civil Society, that we founded thinking that there is so much great work done in French that we don't know about it. Those who don't, that we don't read French perfectly, that now many of those key articles have been published into Spanish. This particular special issue that I edited is key works in Spanish. I said before Spanish, but it was French, from French to English, and then this one's from Spanish to English. So we can have a better understanding. We need to now work on the Italian, that we know that Paul thought that there were not many works done on the Italians in Libya, but we know that there is. Olivia brought something that I really love, the dictatorship of virility. That's something that, as a professor of gender studies, is one of my hats, in addition to my work on the Freemasons. I think it's something that we need to think about, the aspects of patriarchy, the critique to scholars that, Freemasonry, as we know, we need to think about laicism would not have been possible without the work of the Freemasons and the Masonic lodges. Something as important as the separation of the church and state, the religious tolerance, and so on and so forth, that's pivotal. The Freemasons were key, and many of us who study that. However, we need to also, within our scholarship, we need to think, what about these great figures, why they did not, or they dismissed the work of women? And why? Because trying to save tradition, we did not consider women and other sexual minorities. And just also the idea of thinking about gender as a social construction, like Baudelaire, Foucault, and some other scholars have done. And the idea of the reconstruction, thinking about new values based not on sex, I think is something very important. I think that the Victorian period has long gone, and Michel Foucault, another French philosopher, has thought about how much we based our societal values into the Victorian practices. And we are no longer in Victorian times, and I think we need to think about beyond that. And there have been examples given today by all the speakers about how things have happened, and the Eastern Star was founded many years ago, where women and men practiced together, and the so-called lodges in which men and women practice together, and there is no the destruction of Freemasonry, so it can be done. And then we went to Italy, which is the women in Freemasonry Italy is younger. As you know, in Italy we need to think about the role of the Catholic Church, the role of Rome. That is not as in other countries when totally anti-clerical and so on and so forth. They are there, so it is a little bit younger masonries. However, women were there. Women have been able to participate, and Emanuela helped us to understand the different obediences, the two different lodges, and how Italy is not the exception in terms of the recognition, the regularities and irregularities. And finally, Demetrio, that I'm not going to go much about it because it's so recent that we don't need a reminder of what happened. But I think there is the topic of lodges in the diaspora that I think we need to study more, perhaps another topic for look at Paul for another conference. And in immigration, migration, what are the differences, in terms of hybridity and what this Cuban scholar Fernando Ortiz calls transculturation? Because we usually think about when immigrants move to a country, or for example, when the Spaniards conquered the so-called New World, or the British colonized this, we think about acculturation. But that's not possible. You have your values from your culture, but also we think about they don't want to assimilate. No, it's not true. They want. I mean, you can see the history of Italians here in the 19th century and Italians now. I mean, the language has been lost, and the food traditions, no. So you see, and that is why Fernando Ortiz talked about transculturation. When you have the influence for your mother culture, then the new culture, and then there is this combination, this mix that becomes a transculturation, because there are different aspects and the different generations influence, and wherever you are, the social construction is also important, but we need to think about that. And I just wanted to share something that we were in Cuba last year, in Havana, at a conference, and there was a very heated debate with some of the Cuban Masons about women in Freemasonry in Cuba and in Latin America. But it's very interesting to see that there is not a specific issue of the United States, that today we talked about it. It's not exclusive of France or Italy. It's something that we need to think about as a society. And in our case, as scholars, that we need to have the evidence. That is why sometimes we cannot claim or make, we can make arguments, but we sometimes don't make them because we don't have the evidence, and it is important to do that. Finally, I would like to thank the audience for being so grateful and patient with us, and to hear our contribution to what we think a contribution to the study of fraternal organizations, and invite you. We have a conference next June in Paris. Sometimes in France, and in a couple of years from now, we will have again the conference here in the United States. You are all invited. In our conferences, we don't charge for registration. It's a tradition that we learn from the Bibliothèque Nationale. In fact, no, actually, in our conference here, also in DC, we don't do that. So we would like to have you and your colleagues. And also we have several journals, the Policy Studies Organization, and I would like to thank Paul, finally, for making all this possible. Thank you, Paul.
Be sure to take all the books.
And also, we have the books. The books, as you know, they are complimentary. Also, if you want to take a complimentary sandwich tonight, please do so. But thank you very much, and see you next year.
Okay.
Thank you.